I've noticed something interesting in the comments on my recent VLOS video. Many people seem to believe that maintaining visual line of sight means continuously looking at the drone. Not occasionally, not regularly, but continuously. As though the moment your eyes leave the aircraft, you've somehow lost visual line of sight. Here's a question. Is that actually what the phrase means? Or have we all quietly adopted an interpretation that isn't quite supported by the words themselves? What does the phrase VLOS, visual line of sight, actually mean? And let's forget drones for just a moment. Imagine I tell you the church steeple is within your visual line of sight. What does that mean? Does it mean that you are currently staring at the church steeple? No. It means that if you choose to look, you could see it. The church remains within your visual line of sight, whether you're looking at it or not. Here's another example. The lighthouse remained within visual line of sight throughout the voyage. Again, nobody is going to interpret that as meaning that the captain spent 6 hours continually staring at the lighthouse. The ordinary meaning of the phrase is that the object is visible, not necessarily being observed every second. So let's look at what the Civil Aviation Authority says. The CAA describes visual line of sight as a flight in which the remote pilot is able to maintain continuous, unaided visual contact with the aircraft. It goes on to discuss maintaining awareness of orientation, position and surrounding airspace. That's a more operational definition. It's concerned with safety, collision avoidance, situational awareness, and these are all perfectly reasonable objectives. But notice something. The wording creates an interesting question. What exactly is meant by maintain continuous visual contact? Let's imagine a pilot glances down for a couple of seconds. Battery check, altitude check, map check, all things that he is going to check to make sure that he is flying as safely as he possibly can. Has he now broken his visual line of sight of the drone? If he has, then virtually every drone pilot is breaking VLOS dozens of times every single flight. If no, then maybe the phrase continuous visual contact is being interpreted more broadly than simply where your eyeballs happen to be pointing. And that's where things become interesting. Imagine this question ended up before a court. Not in a YouTube comment section and not in Facebook, but in a court in the UK. The prosecution might argue the pilot was not looking directly at the aircraft at all times, therefore he did not have visual line of sight. The defence replies the aircraft remained visible and within visual line of sight throughout the operation. Now we're no longer arguing about drones, we're arguing about language. What does maintain visual line of sight actually mean? What does continuous visual contact actually mean? And would a court interpret those phrases literally or operationally? This is where I think many people, particularly drone pilots, miss something. The purpose of visual line of sight is not to force pilots to stare endlessly at an object, maybe a tiny wee dot in the sky. The purpose is safety, situational awareness, collision avoidance. The legal wording and the practical objective are not the same thing. Not necessarily the same thing anyway. And when technology, operational practice and language collide, courts often end up examining what legislators were trying to achieve rather than simply counting words. Here's a question I'd like you to consider. When the CAA says you must maintain continuous, unaided visual contact, do you interpret that as the pilot must continuously watch the aircraft, or the aircraft must continuously remain available for observation? Because those two interpretations are not the same thing. And if they're not the same thing, the outcome of a future court case might be a bit more interesting than maybe drone pilots realise. Now, I'm not telling you which interpretation is correct because it hasn't been tested in court yet, so we don't know. But what I'm suggesting is the question might be even more complicated than many of us have assumed. And as we've seen repeatedly throughout aviation history, sometimes the most interesting discussions begin when we stop assuming that we already know the answer.